Hey everybody, and welcome to part 3, Core Fundamentals of Web Development. In this video, we're going to get an introduction to Flexbox and build out our Navbar. Alright, so following up on part 2 here, we've got our nav placeholder, and we're going to go ahead and build out our Navbar. So the elements that we're going to have, let's take a look at the finished product here. So in our navbar, we basically got this title here, our header, and then we've got the button here to add a new link. So those are the two things that we're going to have inside of our navbar. So to do this, I'm going to first get a div with a class of container with an ID of nav container. And notice that we're using this container class again. We haven't defined what it is in CSS yet, but this is, again, something that you can reuse in lots of different places, and it's actually a class almost exactly the same as a class in Bootstrap that's very common to give your spacing, heavily used in Bootstrap, and I want to do a pretty good job of using and defining classes that are going to be similar to different CSS frameworks out there. So when you guys go and use those, you should be familiar with the idea of what a container is and different elements like that. So we've got inside of our nav, we've got our container class with an ID of nav container. And then I'm going to do an h1 with a class of nav header. And then have it be link saver. And notice I've got my IDs are going to be camel case, so lowercase for the first word and then uppercase for the second. For classes, it's going to be dash and all lowercase. This is just the way I want to do it. You can name these how you want. But this is kind of the format that I'm going with, and this has been, especially for classes, this has been the format that has kind of become the standard. And the last thing we're going to do is add an anchor tag. So I'll do a tab over there. We don't need an href. Typically, an anchor tag would be used to link to another page or to an element within a page. We're going to actually use it more as a button, but it makes more sense styling-wise to use it to have it be an anchor tag. So it's going to have an ID of add button, and then the add button is just going to have the plus character right on your keyboard. And we should see our title and our button here. No styling yet, so now we're going to go ahead and make this kind of what we really want it to be. So I'm going to copy this section header and come down and do navbar. There we go. Forgot one thing. We're going to give our nav an ID of nav. All right. So then we're going to select the nav, and I'm going to do a height of 60 pixels. And let's leave it at that for now. So we should see, where's our, if we select our nav here, we should see it's got a height of 60 pixels. Great. So I'm going to come in now and add our container class that we've talked about. So this is going to be the one that's pretty standard, reused in a lot of different places, especially in Bootstrap and several other CSS frameworks. And we're going to set the width here to just 80%. And then set the margin to 0 auto. Now 0 auto is a kind of trick to be able to center content horizontally. So let's say this and let's see what happens. Can't really see much of a difference here. But if we look at our nav container, if we do this correctly, so its width is going to be 80%, not 80. We should see that now our container here is not quite as wide as the overall nav. So nav takes up the entire width, and then the container takes up the 80% and then centers it in between the nav. Great. So now as we want to see a little difference here, let's set the background color to, we're going to use our variable, so a dark accent color. So this is going to be the background color on the nav, which is the entire screen. So there's that. If we can get out of the selector here. Still not looking that great, but we're getting there. And then a last thing, I'm going to set the margin bottom to be 25 pixels. This is just going to make sure that anything below the nav bar has a little bit of space. All right, now we're going to get into the fun stuff. So let's see, these elements inside of our nav container are basically stacked on top of each other vertically. So let's go ahead and go into our nav container, select that, and we're going to say display is going to be flex. And this is where all the power happens. So now you should see that these things are horizontally aligned one after another. Now Flexbox in general is, give you guys a little bit of background on what Flexbox is. It's a relatively new way to lay out elements on your page, center them, align them, lay them out, in a much simpler and consistent way than what's been in the past. So if you've heard of people talking about floats and clear fixes and all kinds of different tricks that they use to center things and align them, a lot of that stuff has now been taken over by Flexbox, which is a lot simpler. There's also CSS Grid, which is a lot newer, or it's a little bit newer than Flexbox. Has some fantastic stuff for doing grid design and kind of similar type idea. You guys can play around with that and look into that if you want to. We're just going to cover Flexbox in this one. And so let's take a look at a couple of different resources here. The first one that I think has been my go-to resource for Flexbox for a while now is on CSStricks.com. And you'll notice there's several blogs and people and YouTube videos that I tend to follow and reference a lot because they have great content. CSS Tricks is one of them, and it goes through and has all this different terminology for all these different things and examples and great graphics and stuff that you guys can check out. There's also, here's What the Flexbox is a course created by Wes Boss, who has been one of my kind of idols, one of the people that I followed and all the stuff that he's done. He's got fantastic content. He always comes out with new stuff. It's all really great. So you guys should check out What the Flexbox. It's a free course, and it's worth going through and getting your basics down with Flexbox for a little bit extra homework in addition to what we're going to do here. And then a couple more. There's a Flexbox Froggy, which I thought was kind of cool. It's a game that you can play to work on your Flexbox skills. And the last one is a tutorial from Scotch.io, which is, again, one of my favorite resources online. And it's a visual guide to CSS3 Flexbox properties. So let's come back and talk a little bit about the basics here of Flexbox. Now notice when we did a display of flex, and let me select this element. Let me select this, and then I'll get rid of it. So notice by default, divs just stack on top of each other. Divs take up the entire width. Actually, we're just talking about block elements right now. So H1 here should be a block. So H1 is a block element, which means it takes up the entire width, which then forces our anchor tag to start on the next line. So these things basically get stacked vertically. Now Flexbox, let me refresh the page and pull back in our Flexbox property. There we go. So Flexbox has what's called a main axis and a cross axis. So main axis by default, and these can change depending on the properties that you use. Main axis is horizontal. It's left to right, or actually you can reverse it and have it be right to left. So by display flex here, we're basically taking the flex direction to be row. So that's the default. So if I say this, nothing's going to change. So flex direction, the main axis is going to be a row. Now we can change this to be flex direction column, and now these things stack on top of each other in a column, and now it's changed what the main axis is. Now the main axis is going top to bottom, and the cross axis is going left to right. Now let's get rid of this and come back to just our default. So again, we've got our main axis going horizontal or row or left to right, whatever you want to think of, and then our cross axis going top to bottom. Understanding that is going to be really key, so I hope that made sense. So in addition to display flex, and then I'll just leave flex direction in here to row. And notice you can do row reverse and column reverse and a couple of different other things. And this is not going to be a super intensive Flexbox course. This is just kind of an introduction. There's other resources that I pointed you guys to that I hope you take a look at. So we've got our flex direction to be row, and now we can do some alignment and spacing. So one of the things that I want to do, I want to make sure that this nav container takes up 100% of the nav tag. So if we look real quick before I do that at our nav container, notice it doesn't take up the entire height of the nav tag. So if I save this 100%, it's going to take 100% of its parent. So now look at our nav container, and it does take up 100% of its parent. One of the toughest things, one of the trickiest things that I've come across in the past has been trying to center things vertically. Center images or text or something, boxes, whatever it is, inside of a div or something like that. So with Flexbox, this becomes incredibly easy, and it's just align items, center. Now what align items does is it aligns items on the cross axis. So this is going to be where they fall vertically. So let's save this, and we should see that these things now get centered, which is really nice. So again, this is really tricky in the past. Now super simple with Flexbox. You could also do flex start, which will put it at the top. I think that's the default. You can do flex in, put it at the bottom here, and there's a couple of other ones, but for now, flex center is what we want. Now, the next thing you'll notice if we look at our finished product is the spacing in here. We've got our nav header to the left, and then all the way over here is our button. So how do we get this spacing? Now, in the past, you could do things with floats. You could float your button to the right, and it would kind of work out, but you have some tricky things with ClearFix, and it's probably not even worth getting into that right now. But if you're interested in kind of why this problem used to be such a big deal, go look into that. All right, so we want to basically put space. We want to take up all of the available space in the container from here to here or so, and we want to put space in between these two elements. So if we come in and set our justify content property, which justifies content on the main axis being row or horizontal or whatever you want to call it, we can do lots of things. Let's play around with center. This is going to center them horizontally. See that? And then you could also do flex start, which is the default. So that's what we saw before. You could do flex end. Notice these properties are pretty similar to the other one. Now it's at the end. And there's also one for space between. And it's going to fill the entire width with space. And it's going to put all of that extra space in between these two elements. So let's just save this. And that's exactly what we want. If we look at this, we've got our header to the left, and then we've got our add button all the way to the right, which is exactly what we want, and it's perfect. And super simple. So last couple of things I'm going to do, I'm going to come in and style our nav header. We'll set the color to be light accent color. And notice in Visual Studio, I don't have to type var. I can start typing the name of the variable. I get some IntelliSense. I can press enter, and now it auto-completes it for me. So our nav header is going to have light accent color, and then our font size is going to be 28 pixels. And then lastly, we'll style our add button. So add BTN, and font size is going to be 24. And then color is going to be light accent color as well. And again, here's the beauty of using these variables is that I'm not having to manually type out this color anymore. I'm using our variable, and if I wanted to, let's say, save this. Notice those are the colors we want. If I updated this to be red or something, I don't have to go back and update every time it's used. I just update it in this one spot. Now, obviously, that's not the color scheme that we want to use, so I'm going to undo that, go back to what we have, and this is looking pretty good for what we've got. So we've got a quick introduction to Flexbox. We're going to talk more about that in a later video to talk about basically doing a grid system and doing a responsive design, and we're going to add some more to the Navbar later. But for now, we've just got a brief introduction to Flexbox. We've built out our Navbar, and we're ready to move on to the next video. I'll see you guys there.